It's this non-responsive nature of companies when people are applying for jobs. Like people are being
Yes.
ghosted and things like that. That is such a big pet peeve of mine. Of course, you're not going to hire everyone, but why are we leaving people hanging for weeks and months or
Right.
forever, letting them
Right.
know where they are in the process?
Good Monday morning. Have you ever wondered how successful and happy people got their starts? Every success story begins somewhere, often more humbly than you'd expect. I'm Leilani Brown, host of Your First Job, the podcast. Good Monday morning, everyone. I'm Leilani Brown, and welcome to Your First Job. I am delighted and thrilled to bring with you my friend, Kerry Chandler, who has been a global HR leader and thought leader in the space of future of work. Kerry has worked for such big name brands as Bombas, Christie's, Endeavor, Under Armour, Disney, IBM, the National Basketball Association, and so many others. And today she's a board member and she's going to talk to us about the future of work and what to expect in the days ahead. Did I get everything right, Kerry? Welcome.
First of all, thank you so much, Leilani, and you got it right enough. So
I got it right enough. You've had an amazing career and an amazing path that I admire so much. So that's description leading to where you are now. But how would you describe what you do now?
Sure. No, and thank you very much. I think you creating this platform is amazing, especially for, young people who are struggling so much in terms of what do I do? How do I do it? What's the path in front of me? So I was thrilled when you asked me to do this. So right now I'm doing corporate board work and some nonprofit board work as well. The two corporate boards I'm on, one is Redfin, the realty company, which is a public company. And I'm also on the board of a company called Lyra Health, which is a late stage company. It's a private company still. Many of your listeners may be familiar with it because we provide benefits to major companies, and the benefits are in the mental health care space. So if you think of a company that has an employee assistance program, it's EAP, but far more in terms of really high quality mental health care services that are very outcome based. And I absolutely love being on that board. And then on the nonprofit side, I'm spending my time a little bit with the Jimmy V Foundation for Cancer Research, but specifically they created a fund in honor of Stuart Scott, who was a very famous broadcaster on SportsCenter on ESPN. And he died very young of cancer. And so the fund that they created in his name, all of the money goes towards Black cancer research, which is awesome. So I love being involved in that. Yeah, thank you. And then also there's an organization called Becca that our mutual colleague Jerry DeVard formed, the Black Executive CMO Alliance, and I'm on Jerry's board as well. So that's pretty much how I'm spending most of my time. A lot of people ask me if I'm going to go back into a CHRO role. I say maybe, but it would have to be a really, really special company. They then say, well, what does that mean? And I say, I'll know when I see it. But in a nutshell, I think at this point in my career, I say it has to be a phenomenal brand, a phenomenal leadership team, and 100% alignment of the company and the leadership team with what I consider to be my values. So that's kind of where I am right now.
I think that's a great place to start because there are companies that are special and unique, and employees do choose, like you are, to join an organization because of its alignment with its values or choose not to. Mm-hmm. What are some of the hallmarks, and you've worked for a number of big ones, what are some of the hallmarks of companies that you would deem special?
In terms of values? Well, one, I really think it's important that there's a steadfastness in terms of what you say is important, both internally and externally. In our current environment right now, we see people, backtracking on commitments that they made in the diversity space, as recently as 4 or 5 years ago. But there's other examples as well where, companies tend to sort of go with what the popular tide is, as opposed to, hey, these are the things that we believe in. And we're going to use these values to sort of test ourselves during the hard times. So that's one of the things that I look at, and I think it's just as important in terms of like friendships and, people who we choose to spend our time around. I also, from a human resources perspective, there are so many companies that say, people are our most important resource, etc. But when you see the actions, they don't really demonstrate that. And especially as an HR executive and an HR professional, that's really, really important to me. And, I love that this is about your first job, because when we get into that, I think in preparing for this, I was thinking about like, wow, how did I become that way? And I think a lot of it does have to do with my first job.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. What was your first job? And you grew up, give me a little bit of context. So you grew up in Oklahoma.
No. Well, it's
No?
funny that you say that. So I have, there's 7 kids in my family. 4 of us have the same mom and dad. Of the 4 of us that have the same mom and dad, I'm the only one who did not grow up in Oklahoma. I was actually born.
Okay.
Yeah, I was born and raised in California. I was born in Berkeley, raised in San Diego. And I was the kid of the 7 kids. I have 3 stepbrothers, but of the 7 of us, I was the kid that sort of left San Diego and never looked back. I'm the only one who never moved back to San Diego. I left home when I was 17.
Are you the youngest?
No. So again, of those 4, I was the youngest. And then when we had the blended family, one of my stepbrothers were the same age, and then 2 are younger than me.
Okay.
So
okay.
People used to say we were the Black Brady.
The youngest, the middle child.
Yes, exactly. There you go. And the youngest girl for sure. So I graduated from high school a year early. So I had just turned 17-ish when I left to go to college in August. And I went to a small HBCU, Lincoln University in Missouri. And I can't remember, Leilani, if it's your undergraduate degree or your master's degree, but I think you have a degree in public administration.
Yes, I have a master's in public administration.
Okay,
yes.
So,
and I know that you have a BS in public administration.
Yes. So you'll like this story. So I got my undergraduate degree in public administration, and candidly, it was because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I go to Lincoln University, small HBCU. I chose the school because I followed in the footsteps of one of my older sisters. Had no idea what I wanted, sort of to do ultimately in life, or even what I wanted to major in. So I picked public administration because I thought it was sort of the perfect combination of sort of getting a business degree, but with the public sector focus, and, it'll sort of allow me to do anything. I ended up being a really, really great student in college. And when I graduated, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So here's a fun fact that really isn't anywhere in my bio or my resume. I ended up going to Washington, D.C. and started to get a master's degree at American University in public administration. So I was going to school full-time, working part-time at a lobbying organization. And the whole time, Leilani, I was thinking, I'm not really interested in this. Like it didn't get my juice on. Yeah, exactly. And so after my first year there, I had the opportunity to go to St. Louis, which was 2 hours away from where I went to college. And I had an aunt there, and I was just staying with her for 2 weeks. It was like a little break between the 2 years, the 2-year program at American University. And I went to visit some friends from college. And so while I was visiting her, I ended up, too long of a story for this podcast, but I ended up getting this exploratory interview at what was called McDonnell Douglas then. It's now the Boeing company. They were headquartered in St. Louis at that time. So I go in, I meet with all these human resources professionals, and it was very exploratory. And they said, how long are you going to be in town? I said 2 weeks. They said, well, why don't you come back and see us next week? So very naively, I came back to see them next week. And they had me talk to some more people, and they said, we want to make you an entry-level job offer, in human resources. It was an employee relations representative. And I remember saying to the vice president of human resources, I said, wow, that's so exciting. I said, but I don't really know anything about human resources. I was, I guess, 21 years old. And he said, that's okay, we'll teach you. He said, you've done really well in school, and, we love your enthusiasm, and, we'd love to have you. And I literally went back to DC, packed up my stuff, and I don't know if you remember that little small U-Haul truck they used to have, with a friend, drove that truck myself from DC to St. Louis. And that's how I ended up in human resources at what was McDonnell Douglas at the time and is now the Boeing company.
There's so much in that story and in that anecdote that we can pull from and learn from. Let me see if I can get it all into the question. So first thing is this idea of not knowing what you want to do, but being open. Yes. And or sort of open, or exploring and experimentation. and maybe just experimentation in just taking the first job, not the perfect job, not the ultimate job, but the first job, and the value in just doing it, because what else are you doing? I
Right.
think that a lot of people, right? Like, I think a lot of people put a lot of pressure on ourselves that, like, that's not what I want. That's not what I want to do. When there is so much value and so much to learn in the first job, even if you're only learning what you don't like. Can you talk about where if you remember where your mind was in terms of just doing the first job? Was it a nice check, a sort of a different experience, or, what could go wrong? Where were you in your thought process?
It's funny. It was a little bit of all of those things. I remember really wanting to make what I consider to be at the time money, because
Right.
I was at this independent streak, and I don't know if it's because of how I grew up with all these kids in the family or whatever, but I just wanted to be able to like make my own way. When I was in DC, my parents were having to help me a little bit pay for my apartment, and as nice as that was, I actually hated that. Like, I wanted to
Mhm.
be able to do everything on my own. So I remember, I think my first salary was like $21,000. You couldn't tell me anything, girl. I thought I was like,
You're like, I'm rich.
exactly. I'll be really honest, for your listeners, part of it, I was motivated by money. I remember during these interviews that I really liked these people. Like, I felt like, wow, I'm just having like normal conversations. It didn't feel like intimidating or anything. And at some point, I want to talk about my first boss, but um, and then once I started doing the work, so it was employee relations. So my job was when work related issues would come up either between employees or an employee and their supervisor, that sort of rose to the level of someone was asking for help from someone in human resources, I would get involved in those issues and help investigate them and try to help solve these work related issues. And I remember thinking, wow, you can actually have a job where you're helping other people with their job. And
Right.
there was something about that that felt really, really good to me. The other thing is the part of the company I was working for was called McDonnell Aircraft Company. So we made military jets for the U.S. military. And
Mhm.
maybe 300 feet down the hall from my cubicle, because that's what it was, you go through the double doors, and there was the factory. And I love the fact that I got to start my HR career in a sort of factory type setting, because
Mhm.
it showed me the value that it showed me two things. Number one, the kinds of issues people have at work, they are the exact same issues for junior level employees as they are for executives. They may
Right.
manifest themselves differently or look a little differently, but it's the same kind of stuff. And I think it really taught me very, very early sort of the power of helping people at work, and how bad people's experience can be at work when they're experiencing things where there wasn't any help in terms of how to resolve. And some of these were not even big
Yeah.
issues, like I don't get along with my supervisor because not really big issues, but they just needed somebody to sort of mediate a little bit.
Yeah.
And that felt really, really good to me.
Yeah. Can you help people understand how that opportunity presented itself? You weren't even seeking it. I'll step back for a second. Just released my fourth book, Your Next Giant Steps: 25 Practical Tips for Job Search Success. In it, there's a literal chapter, and they're all small chapters. It's a quick read, that says it's not just an informational interview. And there's
Mm,
no anything in this process, in this arc of search, that's just an informational interview or just a cocktail party or just a
yes.
networking event. So you're walking into it sort of naive, right? If I can
Hmm.
say that, into this
Yes.
informational interview, and you walk out with a job.
Right.
So, and I'm sure that in the last several, years of your work, you've come across talent that were unassuming and thinking it was something that it not thinking how big of an opportunity it was. What
Yeah.
what what advice would you give to people who are listening around setting up informational interviews and networking opportunities and treating them in a non-icky way, uh, treating them as the true opportunities that they are? Because that's a
Right.
big deal.
No, it is a big deal. And so, the story I said, it's too long of a story to tell for this podcast. I will say that so there was a distant relative who worked at the company who introduced me to this person in human resources who actually ended up being my first boss. He jokes with me even today. He's still a mentor of mine today. He always says, Kerry, the real reason we hired you is so that you would stop calling me. And back then, right. And so back then, nobody was emailing or anything. But I probably, without knowing it, found the proper, in spite of what he said, I probably found the proper balance between letting this person know, hey, I'm interested in like hearing a little bit more about what you do without being a complete pain in the what. So that there's that. But the beauty of your question, Leilani, is knowing that you never know where the next opportunity is going to come from.
Right.
You never know where the connection is going to come from. People talk about networking. I always think if you show up in life, meaning to events and on calls and on in meetings and on video Zoom meetings or whatever, if you show up with sort of a genuine enthusiasm and curiosity, you never know where that will lead. I will also say, and this may have been a little bit embedded in your question, that during these processes, make sure that you are really thoughtful about how you're treating people. I will tell you, during my process where I'm hiring people, I've eliminated people because I hear a little story about how they maybe did or didn't speak to the receptionist, or fill in the blank. You're only showing up for the people who you think sort of matter. Well, speaking of companies that that are aligned with your values, where I work and the kinds of teams I like to run, everybody matters, and so it's that presence and that thoughtfulness and that care that you're showing for others, the same kind of thing you want shown for yourself in every sort of opportunity. You'd be sitting next to somebody on an airplane. You assume, because they have on sweats or something, that could be like the CEO of the company or whatever, Right. So I think it's a really important question.
You really never know. We are possibly graduating the class of 2025 into a job market that is starting to shrink a little bit, or by all accounts, you have layoffs and you're hearing these very frightening stories. From your purview, where are you optimistic and where are there opportunities? Because I do believe that there are some opportunities, but they might look a little different than what we had already planned. Sort of where are some of the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little cliche, but there's tons of opportunities in tech. And, tech is both a thing that people do, but it's also an industry. So I tell people not to be fearful of that. So, for example, you can work at a tech company without being an engineer. You can work in finance, in human resources, in marketing, et cetera. So understanding the broad spectrum of what a company has to offer. I remember when I was working at the NBA, people were like, wow, that's got to be like so cool. What's it like to work there? I'm like, well, it is cool, but it's the same thing as working for any other company. Like, we have all the same functions and departments and things like that. So from an industry perspective, I would definitely say tech. It's interesting, I was talking to someone the other day, nursing, somebody was telling me, actually it was my niece, she was telling me that 3 of her 4 closest friends from college all entered the nursing field. I said, well, I can tell you somebody who's not looking for a job. And we kind of laughed. She was like, yeah, they can walk into any place, anywhere and get a job.
And write their ticket, really. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I'll be honest, those are the 2 that immediately come to mind. But I think that, companies both large and small are always looking for really, really good people. So like, how do they know that I'm people who are going to show up, who are like eager and hungry and grind and when I talked about curiosity early, it's like the curiosity outside of your immediate job responsibility. I think that sort of, and for me anyway, that was like a ticket to every next role. And I was not thinking I want to be a CHRO one day. I wasn't even thinking of, chief human resources officers. I was just like, wow, that looks interesting what they're doing over there in human resources. As a matter of fact, my second job at the company was college recruiting, because I kept seeing, wow, these people get to go to these campuses and recruit people. I want to do that one day, and I asked if I could join a trip. I wasn't trying to like move into the department. And so I volunteered to sort of help. And that's how I ended up
Right.
moving into that area. Yeah.
Yeah. We have some listeners who are career changers or career shifters or sort of a little further along, experienced talent as opposed to emerging talent, who
Mhm.
will also find themselves in the job market. I have two questions for you. You've been on the other side of the hiring table, the hiring manager, the person looking at talent.
Mhm.
What have been some of the best answers to your question about why are you looking for a person who lost their job, was either terminated, laid off, going through a transition? What have been some of the best answers to that question about tell me about where you are and how you landed here? And I asked that question because so many times we are carrying around this unearned level of shame
Mm.
related to our current job status. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think that that shame doesn't have its place in the interview.
Mm.
So, what are some of the best, most effective ways that a person can answer the question about why they find themselves unemployed at this particular time?
Wow, that's awesome. I'm going to answer that and then a tangential question because I think they're very related. A question that you didn't even ask me yet, but
Go
one
ahead, ask it, add it all.
questions that need answers, right? I would say, and it sounds very simple, but tell the truth, And now, if you were fired for cause, I'm gonna put that aside because I don't think anybody who was fired for cause is even listening to your podcast, but maybe they are. So if you want me to come back to that, I can. But if you were laid off, just say, especially if it's a company people know, I would just say, as you know, fill in the blank company had a downsizing in February, and I was part of that. My department went from 20 people to 10 people, and my function was eliminated. It was all about cost cutting. And, you can tell a little bit of a story if you want to about, fortunately, I got a little bit of severance, but it also gave me an opportunity to take a look at what I've been doing in my career and what I want to do next. And then stop talking. I think the other thing is people like keep going on and on and on, like,
Yes.
just at some point, like tell it and stop. If they want to
And
know
let it
more,
sit there. The pause is never as long as you think it is.
exactly. Exactly. Let it sit there. And if they want to know more, they're going to ask more,
Yes.
usually. And so just the whole thing about, the truth will set you free, old girl Judge Judy, she always says, if you tell the truth, you don't have to have a good memory. I
That's
love
true.
that one. I love that one. And so, just to be honest, to your point, there's no shame in it. And sadly, companies are using layoffs as, in my view, almost too convenient of a tool now. So I don't think anyone's going
Mhm.
to be shocked. I think when you start, fumbling and bumbling through the answer is when it seems like maybe you're not telling the truth, even if you are. So
Right.
just be
Right.
straightforward. And by the way, practice your answers to some of the more difficult questions, either with yourself in the mirror or ask a friend to do a mock interview with you. And then your comfort level, I think, is much higher.
Yeah.
And then the real quickly, the tangential question. So this is my pet peeve in interviews. When I ask the person to talk to me about something that they really want to work on, with respect to themselves. Some people say, tell me, I hate the question, what your weaknesses are. I never use that word, but like, what are your development areas, etc. And then the person starts naming something that's really not a development area. So here's the typical one that
Right.
you get. Well, I tend to be a workaholic. I'm like, girl, that's a strength, right? I mean, not
Right.
really. Like when someone tells me something that is a true development area, I literally don't care, Leilani, what they said. It's just a huge plus in my book. If they give me that whole soft thing about, I
Yeah.
tend to, it's something about being a workaholic or it's always something, to be honest, in that area. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I'll probe with them. Can't believe when people ask me.
Right.
I tell a story of one of my 360 development process things where somebody wrote in the thing in the comments about me when she thinks she has a point, you can't get a word in edgewise. Tell that story. That's true. I'm still working on it.
I
So there we
think
go.
it's so that is great advice, because I think people are missing the opportunity to communicate something really important, which is a healthy self-awareness, which can
Yes.
be a superpower
Yes.
that around around performance. And I'd also say that, and this is going to be really tangential, but you have the things that you're really expert at, the things that you are, at a mid-range, acceptable range, and the things that you're not good at. And the conventional wisdom would be, or would suggest, that you need to really work on the things that you're not good at. Where, in certain areas, as you grow in your career, you might want to just really cultivate that expertise in that mid-range and not worry about the things that you're not. There are things in all of our careers that
Right.
we're just not going to be great at doing.
Agree. I completely agree. And then if you're fortunate enough that you have a team, being aware of that allows you to hire somebody who's really strong in that area and give them the opportunity to,
Yeah.
sort of shine in that area. You know enough to be sort of dangerous to lead whatever area you're leading, but some specific area within marketing or human resources or finance, if it's not your strength, you hire someone really, really strong there. Don't pretend.
Yeah. Yeah. So keeping with that idea, how can a candidate, no matter where you are, because I think this is a relevant question, no matter where you are in your journey, adopt the mindset of the hiring manager? How can
Mm.
they sort of anticipate uh, how they might be thinking and looking to source talent so that it makes them a better candidate?
So one of the things I always suggest, and it seems really simple, but it's amazing how many people don't do it, is in preparing, people study a lot about the company and the role. They don't usually go study enough about the person. I've been in
Mhm.
interviews, and when it gets to the part about, oh, so do you have any questions for me? And actually, or sometimes a lot of times I'll start off telling them just a little bit about my background, and they're like, oh wow, and I'm thinking to myself, you didn't know that? Like, it's all Googleable, even
Right,
though I'm
right,
so, and I think the beauty of going to, Leilani's LinkedIn or searching, you can find out all the things that you've done in your career. Sometimes you can find interviews like this, like, oh, wow, that's one of the things that's her
yes,
pet peeves. Like the things you can find out about the person and people that you're interviewing with, it can just be like mind blowing in terms of making it more conversational and knowing what that person's, maybe what some of their hot buttons might be. So that's
right.
probably the biggest suggestion that I make. And then a piece of advice that, and I will tell you, I learned this probably definitely in the latter part of my career, is it's kind of related to your question, but it's like, how do I handle when I have to have a difficult conversation with someone? I think about what I'm going to say, and then I envision that person saying that to me. And if I can't hear that, like if I'm like, if somebody said that to me, I would feel very defensive. Or if somebody said that, then I change
Right.
the way I say it. So trying to literally, not only think of the question, but think about if you heard that answer. Would you think that's a
Mhm.
canned answer? Did you think you got that off of AI? Or would that sound like a really authentic answer where you're helping that person learn about who you are? And it's just like a date, okay? If you go on a date and you're trying to act like I don't eat a lot, well, I do eat a lot, okay? So
Pass
I
the
do
bread.
that, right? If I do that on the first date, what's going to happen on the second date? Like, you want people to sort of get to know who you are and how you're going to show up at work. It's very tough because an interview process can be very sort of artificial, but make sure you do your part to make it as authentic as possible. You want
Mhm,
to show up as
mhm.
professional, but you want them to get an idea of who you are. It's who you are that might make them hire you. Because
Right,
you stuck out for a certain reason. You were different from the other people that they interviewed. And I think people are
right.
so concerned trying to make it seem like something they're not, or making sure they're answering everything so perfectly that sometimes that doesn't come across, and it's a shame.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think people would think naively, again, that sitting at the top of the HR leadership chain, that it's a very it's a narrow focus. But I think that global HR leaders like yourself have a more strategic impact across the whole of the company and culture at a company. Can you talk about healthy cultures in
Mhm.
terms of inclusion, equity, but beyond that, how that impacts productivity, casting a
Mhm.
wide net for talent, and the culture at the various companies that you've worked in? Because I think you've had probably a pretty unique purview, not only managing the function of human resources, having oversight of culture and employee engagement, but also being advisor to the CEO and the board. How
Right.
does culture impact performance and profitability of a company?
Yeah, so a couple things, and I'm going to link it a little bit back to, believe it or not, my first job, and then tie it into your question. So, one of the things I learned really early in my HR career was the importance of being a really strong sort of partner to the business and never forgetting to be an employee advocate at the same time. I think some people miss that lesson in the human resources function. I think it is really, really important, Leilani, because so often when you're in the C-suite and you're there to your point, be strategic, help figure out the people related stuff that's going to drive the business agenda. There are far too many of my colleagues, I find, who aren't, they're sort of forgetting about that employee advocacy piece. And the importance of that is 9 times out of 10, you may be the only person in that room who's going to say, yeah, but let's remember such and such. Or yes, before we move to making sure to thinking we have to do this layoff, have we looked at, reskilling? You may be the only person who's going to like move that conversation, even if temporarily, in a different direction. And so many people are just like, I got to look like I have my, business P&L hat on. So I'm just going along with everything that they say because it's all about cost cutting, et cetera. I have found, especially with the CEOs and presidents that I've worked really, really well with, they value that. That's what they're
Mhm.
hiring for. They already have a CFO sitting around the table and the head of sales and the head of this or whatever. So, kind of don't be afraid to remember that balance and to bring that into the decision making of these important conversations. But to your larger question, everything that we do from a human resources perspective in terms of the kinds of processes that we put in place, like I like to think about it in terms of the employee life cycle or the employee journey. That begins when you're applying for a job at a company. That's the beginning of that relationship. If you don't get the job, there's something there. If you do get the job, then it's about onboarding. After onboarding, it's about, making sure the person understands what they have to do and that they're getting feedback. So that's the development or performance review process. There's the processes in terms of how you move into another role. If it's a big company where you can, all of these things have to be sort of tied to the overall objective of what the company is trying to achieve. Otherwise, it's like, why are we doing them, right?
Right,
And
right.
so I think that just always, I always try to think about that employee life cycle and all of the different things. Even, when someone decides to leave, either voluntarily or involuntarily, what does that process look like? I always say
Mhm.
it's far easier to onboard an employee than it is to exit an employee, even if they're leaving
It's
on their
true.
own. I always say if somebody's leaving our company, I want them to still be like a customer or a fan or whatever it happens to be. Like,
Right.
let's treat people well along the way, along this journey. So I think at every touch point, we have to be uber conscious of how we're communicating with these people who are moving through our life cycle. And one of the things I learned really, really early in my career, and Leilani, I'd be surprised if you haven't, in the work that you do, come across this. It's this non-responsive nature of companies when people are applying for jobs. Like people are being
Yes.
ghosted and things like that. That is such a big pet peeve of mine. Of course, you're not going to hire everyone, but why are we leaving people hanging for weeks and months or
Right,
forever, letting them
right.
know where they are in the process? Or,
Yes.
the process is so automated that as soon as they apply, they're getting a rejection email because something
Right.
wacky is going on in your talent acquisition system or whatever. Those are the kinds of principles that I learned about early in my career. There, you could talk to anybody who's ever worked on a team of mine. They're like, if you're going to see Kerry not be happy, let somebody have to contact her because you didn't get back to them.
Just to
And a
say
lot,
that it was a terrible process, and
yeah,
that is such a reflection.
Yes, yes. And I always tell people, one of my mantras is something is better than nothing. Usually the excuse is, well, I didn't get back to Leilani because I was still waiting for the hiring manager to blah, blah, blah. How does she know that? Why don't you share that with her? Hey, Leilani, thanks very much for
Right.
your interest. It looks like Kerry's going to take another 2 to 3 weeks before she makes a final decision. Feel free if you have any, like, don't leave people
Yeah,
hanging like that. It's demoralizing for them.
it
And I just
is.
wanted to make sure I got that in because I learned that, and something that stayed with me throughout my entire career, not just for hiring, but
Yeah.
for anything when you're dealing with human resources, right?
Yeah. I think candidates should understand the interview process is a two-way evaluation,
Hmm.
and your candidate process is a set of data for you to
Yes,
evaluate.
yes.
I recently was on the hiring side, a committee hiring side for a search, and
Okay.
we were intentional going into the search, to your point, and we said, for whoever does not get the job, we want that all of those people, because we can only hire one, all of those people to feel good about
Yes.
their experience, so much so that they would be an advocate and an
Mm,
ambassador for the organization going forward. So we were intentional
yes.
going into that. So I'm glad you said that, and I think that those are yellow flags, not red flags, but yellow flags. I mean, if there are red flags in the
Yeah,
process, but there are yellow flags that you should think about. And also, I'd add, how many people do I have to talk to before you actually make a decision? I
right. You keep
remember one process.
adding people.
I remember a process personally. I'll share. I talked to 19 people,
See,
and I said, "This is data for me to consider about how many people it takes to screw in a light bulb." I was like,
I mean,
"Never again."
and it also says something about their decision making. Like, are
That's
you
right.
trying consensus from like all of these people?
Right. Right.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
never been on so many first dates in my life.
Right. There you go.
Imagine.
Exactly. No, that's two-way
Same
street.
questions. Yes.
Yes. You're interviewing
Yes.
the company while the company's interviewing you. Yeah. We can
Yeah.
all be thirsty when there's a job we want, but don't go in all dehydrated where you're that thirsty. So
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm going to ask you about the worst advice you've ever received and the
oh,
best advice. But what's the worst advice? But let me just ask you your opinion on some advice that I think is not great out there. And that is uh, this idea to follow your passion
mm,
and, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Um, I think there's room to love what you do and to be
yeah.
passionate about what you do. But there's a practical reality of how around having to work and
Right.
and working towards your calling or following your passion after hours or later on the weekends or at night.
Mhm, mhm.
What is your perspective on that advice? Do you like that advice, by the way?
Listen, I think you and I are probably aligned on it because I mean I've had some wonderful, roles in my career. But this whole thing about if you love what you do, it's always felt like work to me, because
Right,
I work
right,
really, really hard. And, I always tell
right.
people, like, never forget it's an exchange. It's an exchange of money for a service. I know
Yes,
that may sound horrible, but that's all it is. It's an exchange of
yes,
money for a service. That service may
yes,
mean you're making a product, it may mean you're doing something, but it is an exchange. And so I I do believe if you hate your job, that you need to work really, really hard to find something else because whether you
yes,
think it or not, that is showing up. Okay. But
yes,
this whole concept of loving your job and the beauty of your question is embedded in your question, Leilani, is the importance of trying really, really hard to have a full life. And so, your work and your profession is part of it. There are some people where, they work with their spouse or something like that, where maybe there is, overlap, or they have a family business or something like that. But if we're talking about these corporate settings, it's an exchange. It should be a meaningful part of your life. It should be a part of your life where you're not only learning to do things, but you're learning about yourself. That's another thing. I
yes,
think every role you're in is an opportunity to learn something about yourself, like what you like, what you don't like, what you're great at, what you're not, how you communicate under stress, how you communicate when you're in a great mood, all of these different things. But, it is what it is. And to be able to have that sort of variety in your life, I'm not even going to say balance, because it doesn't have to be an equal weights or whatever. But to your point, what are some of the things that you do when you're not at work? During COVID, we talk about COVID. The thing I dislike the most about COVID is I was always a person, if I had to stay in the office to some crazy hour, I would rather do that than bring work home, because I wanted to make sure that when I opened up the door of my apartment, it just felt like something else. It felt like a different space. And I couldn't do that with COVID. It was all intermingled or whatever. But so, yeah, I'm not real keen on that particular advice.
On that advice. Well, what's been the best advice that you've ever received in your career?
Oh my gosh, I've gotten so much great advice. I've gotten some bad advice as well too, but okay, may he rest in peace. So Commissioner David Stern is who I work for at the NBA, and if there's any basketball fans that are watching, they'll know that the commissioner, he had a reputation for being like really, really tough and difficult, and he was. But he was one of my best bosses and someone asked me the other day, like, why I felt that way. I was at NBA All-Star Weekend last weekend, and I said, well, because I felt myself growing and getting better under his leadership. His bar was so high, and it was unrealistically high, but he did that on purpose to kind of make you stretch and grow. He was also the kind of boss that if you wanted to debate something with him, he never even had a hint of, I'm the boss, you're not. Like, he loved to debate. He's like, bring it on. He didn't care who
the
you were.
The exchange of ideas was welcome.
And that was so empowering to me. Like, that's why, like, anybody who deals with me who, they're like, you could tell they're into like the position. It's probably not going to go well, because I worked for Commissioner Stern. He didn't care. He was just like, bring it on kind of thing. Yeah. But I remember one of the things that, and he taught me this almost not by saying it, but by me watching him, talking to owners and things like that, is never negotiate with yourself. And just a funny story is, we had employment contracts at the NBA. And so when he was doing my second contract, he presented something to me, and I was like, yeah, David, that's not going to do it for another 3 years. So he was like, well, then come back to me and tell me. No, I think I gave him a number first, and he told me no. And I was like, that's the number. And so he kind of tried to wait me out. He waited a couple of weeks, and he was like, you need to come back to me with something else. And I was like, never negotiate with yourself. And he just started laughing. He was like, I got my number too, by the way.
Right. But I'm glad.
Yeah, that was a really, really good one. But this whole concept of authenticity, people overuse it, but I feel like I'm like a strong leader, but I can also be an emotional leader. I mean, almost every team I've worked for they've seen tears come out of my eyes for one reason or another. And I probably had people tell you, like, you're not supposed to like cry at work. And it's not like I'm sitting there in a meeting like boo-hooing and sobbing. But, I've worked through really tough times, aging myself a little bit, but I was an HR professional during September 11th and, COVID and employee deaths and, crazy situations that, kind of rose to the level of, something going on in the company that makes it to the public sphere. I'm not going to name the company, but, things that were like super emotional for employees to have to deal with. And, really working through those things, Leilani, in a real way, in a way where I try to be able to relate to our employees and our executive team and help find like solutions that will work. That stuff is hard work, and it can be emotional. And, I just think, I remember saying to a particular CEO, he actually wasn't talking about me at the time. He was talking about, it happened to be a woman. And he said something about her tearing up in a meeting. And I said to him, I go, what's wrong with that? I said, that's just another form of emotion. How different is that than you yelling in a meeting? And he kind of looked at me and he was like, well, I guess that's a good point. I was like, it is a good point. Get off her.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, but, I just think, just kind of like, we are human beings. We're not robots, and we just have to, I think there is be professional. I'm never saying don't be, but like, there are moments that call for just, it's okay to be also who you are while
Yeah,
you're being professional. So I don't think those things are mutually
absolutely.
exclusive. Yeah.
No, I think, well, first of all, it has made for the depth of this conversation and the richness of this conversation uh, with a person who I will be intentional about cultivating our friendship. But also, it's firm in my belief that incredible leaders are incredibly human. And
Oh.
so, thank you for landing us with that. And thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. This has been really, really enjoyable.
Well, it was more than my pleasure. I will give one shout out because I can't believe I didn't say his name. So my first boss was a guy named Sam Jenkins. He's now retired. He stayed at the Boeing company for like many, many, many years, and he's still a big mentor of mine. And I think he planted the seeds for like what great leadership should look like. And I'm like forever grateful for him as well too. And this was just like really fun, Leilani, because I adore you
That's
and I love what
awesome.
you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Your First Job is a production of Giant Steps LLC, a company working at the intersection of strategy, culture, career, and education. I'm Leilani Brown, CEO and host of the show. Many thanks to our executive producer, Sam Osborne, and Maxwell Brown for producing our show music and this episode. You can learn more about our company and the podcast by visiting giantstepsllc.com. Thank you for listening.